Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate the opportunity to appear here today, and I will follow your suggestion and offer just a brief summary of my extended testimony. China's currency undervaluation is both real and problematic. The conclusion that the renminbi is significantly undervalued has been reached by a wide range of analysts, including the IMF. The clearest indicator is the dramatic accumulation of China's foreign exchange reserves, now estimated at roughly $2.4 trillion. The most acute problems stemming from this policy appear in China itself. For that reason, the situation is vexing but not hopeless. It is in China's own interest to move toward an appreciated currency. China's undervalued exchange rate and mounting reserves pose serious difficulties for controlling Chinese money supply and, in turn, inflation. One analyst recently argued that Chinese policy is cultivating a real estate bubble to compare with that of Japan before its bust in the 1990s. Under its policy, China has been extending large volumes of loans to the rest of the world. For a relatively poor country that is rapidly getting richer, such lending makes little economic sense. Of course, the primary concern of this committee and the Congress is the effect of Chinese practices on the United States. Whether or not Chinese currency practices hurt the U.S. is a subject of vigorous debate among economists and apparently historians as well. Even if one is convinced of the harm, we must be very clear on the likely costs and benefits of potential remedies. In normal times, there are strong arguments that China's exchange rate policies do not hurt the United States. As you mentioned, however, recent arguments made by Nobel laureate Paul Krugman make a contrary assertion. He links Chinese policies to U.S. unemployment, and that linkage relies on the argument that the United States is temporarily in abnormal times. By this, he does not mean a steep recession, which is obvious, but a time when monetary policy has become completely ineffective, a so-called liquidity trap. It is during such a special situation that an increase in net Chinese demand could stimulate the U.S. economy, presumably in a way that the Fed is incapable of doing. By Krugman's reasoning, this offers a relatively short window of time in which a Chinese policy change could have any serious effect. Yet none of the actions that China might plausibly undertake are likely to do this. A gradual currency appreciation of the sort China followed from 2005 to 2008 would not be large enough. A more sudden appreciation, on the order of 20 to 30%, could jolt the Chinese economy so seriously that it would not increase its demand for global goods, at least not in the short run. So what determines whether China will act? There are two major sources of legitimacy for the Chinese regime: economic performance and nationalism. Chinese reluctance to revalue the renminbi hinges on worries about economic performance, specifically the potential demise of large numbers of low-margin businesses in China's export sector. Nationalism, in turn, is likely to mean that China would not react well to unilateral U.S. pressure. In the interest of time, I'd like to focus on just one major proposal to encourage change, the idea of a unilateral tariff on Chinese goods. Compared to other proposals, this would impose the most immediate economic pain on China, but it would also maximize the likelihood of a strong nationalist backlash within China that would preclude Chinese compliance with U.S. demands. By blatantly violating U.S. commitments under the WTO, a unilateral tariff would do lasting damage to the rules-based multilateral economic system. This could be disastrous for a U.S. economy that is globally integrated. Nor should one expect, as Dr. Ferguson also said, that the breakdown in cooperation and relations would be limited to the narrow confines of trade and currency. Advocates of a tariff have set aside these long-term consequences and argued that it could achieve U.S. short-term goals whether or not China complies. This is highly dubious. Such a bilateral measure could be readily circumvented by a reordering of world trade flows, effectively reversing the shift in trade patterns that accompanied China's recent rise. For many of the low-cost goods that China produces, its chief competitors are not U.S. firms, but those in other developing nations. Even if the United States were to enter lines of business from which China had been excluded, such adjustment takes time. Thus, there are few likely short-term benefits to offset the potentially staggering long-term costs. In contrast, multilateral approaches would be neither quick nor easy, but would offer a better chance of eventual success. The United States could work through the WTO, the IMF, the G7, or the G20. By avoiding the antagonisms of bilateral conflict, a multilateral approach could make it politically easier for China to accede to new rules. This is not really a choice between short-term benefits and long-term costs. it is hard to discern a feasible action that China might take that would significantly improve U.S. employment and output in the short run. It is even harder to imagine a scenario in which China would adopt such a policy under the unilateral threat of U.S. punishment. We would be wise to show patience and pursue an approach that relies upon multilateral diplomacy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.